Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Suzanne Pollack, Director of Development and one of the chief party planners for the festival. Thank you to Dr. Janelle Perkins for sponsoring today's session. I know you're here, Janelle, and thank you so much. I am thrilled to introduce Angela Saini and Regina Marler. Angela Saini is an award-winning science journalist, broadcaster, and author. Her fourth book, The Patriarchs, The Origins of Inequality, was a finalist for the George Orwell Prize for Political Writing. Her book explores the roots and various iterations of patriarchy and how more equal societies can be structured and flourish. Saini has a broad expertise. She has produced and presented a BBC documentary on biofuels and a BBC World Service documentary on the impact of climate change on Indian agriculture. Saini holds 2 master's degrees, one in engineering from the University of Oxford and one in science and security from the Department of War Studies at King's College London. In 2009, she was named European Young Science Writer of the Year. She was a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT from 2012 to 2013, and now she teaches science writing at MIT. Regina Marler has been an author and interlocutor at Charleston Literary Festival since the 2nd year. She writes for the New York Times Review of Books, The Advocate, the Times Literary Supplement, and the New York Observer, and other prominent publications. Her fiction has appeared in the North American Review, Carolina Quarterly, and other journals. Regina has edited Selected Letters of Vanessa Bell and Queer Beats, How the Beats Turned America Onto Sex. She wrote Bloomsbury Pie, The Making of the Bloomsbury Boom, and her next book is on the collages of the writer Janet Malcolm. She lives in San Francisco. So please enjoy this session. Thank you.
I was especially excited to see that your book was coming to the festival. I think it's an incredibly timely book, and probably especially so in light of recent events. And I think we've all been reminded the past few months of what happens when women seek power, about the misogynist rhetoric that they'll face and so forth. So this book, though, has been a long time in the works for you. How did it come about?
So first of all, it's such a pleasure to be here. I've never been to Charleston before, and it's a real thrill. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. So 2 books ago, in 2017, I published a book called Inferior, which was looking at how scientists understand sex and gender. So we have a lot of stereotypes about the differences between men and women, and that really was an attempt on my part to try and get to the heart of that. What does the data and the evidence actually say about the differences between men and women? And one thing that anthropologists were telling me at the time was that even though patriarchy is so common now, it hasn't always been this way. So there is a history there. And the one question that readers would always ask me when that book came out was, then how did we get to this? You know, if it hasn't always been like this, then why is it like this now? And I didn't have a very good answer to that question because the literature is so thin, weirdly. So even in feminist texts, often people will assume that it has always been this way, or there is some kind of biological basis for why, you know, men have more power than women in so many societies. And actually, you know, the evidence data doesn't support that, the historical data doesn't support that. So really, this is just, on my part, I just wanted to know for myself. I wanted to be able to answer those readers and say, well, you can start to draw that history. It's very difficult because there is so much variation in different parts of the world in terms of how people think about gender, and the journeys that different states have taken to get to where they are is not consistent, and sometimes states, you know, go back and forth, so they will be less patriarchal, more, and then go back again. So for example, modern day Afghanistan is a good example of this, that the Taliban have, you know, essentially recreated patriarchy for the 21st century in that country when women's rights were going in a positive direction for so long. So I wanted to pin that down. The last big book on this topic was I'm sure many of you know, the late historian Gerda Lerner's book, which is almost as old as I am. So it came out a long time ago. It was looking at ancient Mesopotamia and the changes in women's rights that happened in that time. So we talk about, I shouldn't really use the language of rights when I'm speaking about that time because it didn't really exist. It's anachronistic to think about rights when people didn't think of themselves as having rights. But at least in ancient Mesopotamia, what you saw was that at the beginning, women were doing pretty much everything. They were in leadership positions, very visible in the record, historical record. And then over thousands of years, they slowly disappeared. And there is a much bigger story to be told there. And especially now, we have so much more archaeological data. We have genetic data, which is powerful because it can help us paint a picture of migration. So we know when people lived where and how they moved. We can tell, for example, if we find a settlement, we can say these women grew up in this settlement, or did they come from somewhere else and then were moved here, which gives you a picture of gender then, at a family level. So this is really an attempt to bring all of that together.
Oh, I think you've done a wonderful job with it, and it moves very quickly as well. It's very engaging and a lot of good stories in there. One thing that struck me is that even when there is, we tend to assume that male dominance is, people have always said, not always, but people have been assuming for centuries that this is natural and inevitable, it's immutable, and that's because even in nature we see so much male dominance. But when evidence suggests otherwise, and it takes certain scientists to see it, because we all have our filter, we have our assumptions, we sometimes don't know what to do about it. Tell us about bonobos, for example.
Yeah, I do. I think, I didn't think I'd have to address this in this book because I just assumed that people knew that there wasn't a biological basis for this. But actually, when I was speaking to people, it was the one thing that they would say again and again. Men are on average stronger than women, so that must be the basis for patriarchal power. And actually, number one, I should say that patriarchy is not universal. There are very many matrilineal societies. So these are societies in which inheritance and family lineage is recognized through mothers rather than through fathers.
And sometimes inheritance for...
inheritance for property, things like that. So there's only one illustration in this book, and it's a map of modern day existing matrilineal societies. Yes. There are so many of them, at least 160 that have been documented right across Africa, across Asia, lots of parts, North and South America. And in the past, there would have been even more. So patriarchy is something that has encroached on areas of the world in which there was far more variation in how people lived. So that's number one. If this were biological, you wouldn't see that degree of gender variation in how people live. Number two, it isn't universal among other species. So, when in the 20th century, scientists first started looking at the question of the origins of inequality. How did we get to where we are? They looked at chimpanzees. Chimpanzees, one of the two closest species to us genetically, and they thought, well, chimpanzees are male-dominated, quite clearly. The top of the pack will often be quite aggressive, or will have power and dominance not just over the females, but over the males lower down the pecking order in chimpanzee society. And they thought, well, we are just like them then. That's the human model. That's what we were like in our, primordial origins. But there is another species equally close to us genetically, the bonobo ape. And this is similar to the chimpanzee, slightly smaller. They live in slightly different places. And partly, the story of how it came to be understood that bonobos were matriarchal rather than patriarchal, or at least female-dominated, is a very weird one. So the late Frans de Waal, brilliant primatologist, he wrote a book a couple of years ago, which I reviewed, in which he described telling people through his own and other people's observations that bonobos were clearly matriarchal. He went to a conference to present their findings, which are just irrefutable. In captivity and in the wild, bonobos are female-dominated. And when he said that, one of the One of his fellow scholars got up and said, "What's wrong with these males? why aren't they in charge?" As though they were bucking some kind of rule of nature.
Yes.
And they're not. That's just how they are. And it's nothing to do with size. Bonobo males are still slightly larger than the females. The difference in bonobo society is that the females form very strong bonds with each other, even with other females who aren't kin. And that's crucial here because it's very rare to see that. You know, we are one of the few species in which that happens, that we have strong friendships with people we're not related to. And these bonds are so tight that it's almost impossible for a male bonobo then to move up the hierarchy. And I've seen this for myself. So when I was writing Inferior many years ago, I went to San Diego Zoo where they have a wonderful enclosure, bonobos in captivity. And I went there with one of the world's leading bonobo researchers, Amy Parrish. And just as I got there, a male had been injured. He nearly lost a finger. And he was cowering in the corner on one side. And it turned out that an elder female who was right at the front of the enclosure had injured him. And I don't know for what reason she injured him, but what I did know was that he was nursery reared. And usually male bonobos require their mothers for protection, access to food, access to mates. And because he was nursery reared, he didn't have any of that protection, so he very quickly became a target for violence.
Poor bonobo.
I'm not saying that we're bonobos or chimpanzees. What I'm saying is that there's a lot more room for interpretation about our origins than we imagine.
Absolutely. I mean, you think of the movie The Lion King.
And lions are a female-dominated
exactly.
species.
They are. And, one reason they hypothesized, for the size of males is not to dominate the females, but to compete with each other, dominate with each other for resources, which be food and
that's
females and so forth. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's generally what you see. So what we think of as patriarchy, if you break down that word, what it means is rule of the father. So it stems from this idea that the male, and this is a European idea, that the man is at the head of the family, the king is at the head of the state, he's like the father to the state, and that God is the overarching kind of male deity in charge of, or governing over everybody. And that pattern of kind of the male of the family being the most important member of the family is very unusual among other species. So like I said, even for chimpanzees, which are male dominated, usually that dominance is exercised over other males. It's not generally just the females that are being dominated by all the males in the group. That doesn't happen so much. So it's a very, I wouldn't say it's unique, but it's very unusual in humans. Patriarchy is not similar to other forms of animal male domination.
When you talk about the matrilineal societies that you've studied, what's clear is there's a tremendous amount of variety. There are all sorts of different ways of running a culture, and one interesting thing is that there isn't anything that's exactly the inverse of patriarchy. There isn't any culture in which we have, these nuclear families that are entirely headed by women and so forth. So tell us something about some of these cultures that you have been looking into.
Yeah, I think very often people imagine that for there to be a society that is different to patriarchy, it would have to be female-led. And it was interesting because this came out at the same time that the Barbie movie came out, or just before the Barbie movie came out. And there's a scene, if you guys have seen the film, in which Ken is carrying a stack of books from the library about the origins of patriarchy. None of these books actually exist in real life. And so a lot of people contacted me when this came out and said, is this the book that Ken is carrying in the movie? So the Barbie world doesn't exist. That kind of
that binary,
Amazon-like, flipped reverse of patriarchy doesn't exist. Matrilineal societies generally tend to be matrilocal. So this is where you live in your mother's house throughout your life. So there are some in which goddesses are worshipped. There are very many matrilineal societies that have goddess worship. There are very many matrilocal societies in which people stay in their mother's house to the extent that fathers may not necessarily be raising their own children. They'll be raising their nieces and nephews because they'll be living with their mother and their sisters And so the father can be quite peripheral in these societies. It's the uncle who is the father figure, within these households. And the main authority in the house is the eldest female. So, in India, where my family heritage is from, my parents are from North India, which is very patriarchal. But if you go to South India, it is quite the opposite. And it's palpable when you travel through the country that you feel much freer. You see more women on the streets. You see more women working the further south you go. The women tend to be better educated. In Kerala, which is a famously much more egalitarian state, literacy rates, which until fairly recently were very different between men and women in parts of India, have always been very high for men and women in Kerala. And some people attribute that to the fact that Kerala was home to this very powerful matrilineal society, not a hunter-gatherer society, a royal family, the in Trivandrum, this kind of very, a community in which female education was prized, in which people would celebrate the birth of a daughter because it meant that there would be someone to pass on the name and property to. Everyone lived in these big, beautiful houses, similar to what you can see here in Charleston, these huge taravats in which everybody lived. So your extended family would live there, all the children would live there. And there is a wonderful memoir written by someone who grew up in one of these households in the 20th century. And he writes that when he was young, his amma, so this is the oldest female in his house, would wear nothing from the waist up, because that was just, how women dressed. There was no sense of shame or immodesty about that. That was just, as it was given. And she was hugely well respected. She was, the authority in the household. But what happened over the late 19th and 20th centuries was that with British rule, the British came, they saw this, they saw these matrilineal households, and they were just scandalized. They couldn't understand how it could be this way. Very gradually, British judges in India started passing laws that said that women couldn't own property, that they could only marry one man, because prior to that, you didn't really have marriage of the same kind, that you didn't, like I said, that family relationships would be slightly different, so you had to marry one man, and your husband became the authority in your family. And people resisted it for a long time, but when you're consistently told, and this is a story I think that's familiar in indigenous communities in the US as well, when you're consistently told that your culture is backward, that this is not the way to live, that to be modern you have to live like this, people did it. And it was ironically, it was after the British left that the final death knell for matrilineal came in Kerala, when the legislature said, no more matrilineal. We can't have matrilineal families anymore. And these beautiful big taravats, these gorgeous houses, just fell into disrepair. They were demolished, and there was a scholar who visited them, I think in the 1980s, 1990s, and there would be one elderly person living there who could just about remember how it used to be, and that's it. That's all that remained.
Is there any movement now, as things are advancing a little bit for women in India? Is there any movement to restore that, or part of those cultures, or what's the?
There has been. I mean, so for example, relatively recently, Kerala passed a rule that said that local schools would have a gender-neutral uniform for boys and girls. So basically culottes, so trousers, short trousers that boys and girls would all wear. And everyone was very comfortable with that. Nobody had an issue with it. It is quite similar to what men and women wear anyway in parts of India. But what was interesting was that the way that the local government framed this was as, we are going back to our roots. This is our tradition. Gender equality is our tradition. So, and it's another argument I make in the Patriarchs, that tradition is really what we make it, frankly. We choose what we want to adopt, what we want to keep and retain, and adapt that for the life that we actually want. There is no real, original, perfect past that any of us can actually reclaim in any way. It doesn't exist. It's really about how those in power decide to frame what that past should look like.
But that's the idea, though. We look back historically, and through most of history, we've had both religion and government and family structure telling us this is the way it is. the way it's supposed to be, and,
Yeah.
and the way it always will be.
Yeah.
And then you try to, there is a lot of movement, though, as you say. We're always moving backward and forward and negotiating our places in the world.
Yeah, and we have to remember that political leaders are always doing this. I mean, when Trump, for example, talks about making America great again, we have to always ask ourselves, what does again mean then? What version
point?
of America
Yes, exactly.
are you thinking of?
Yeah.
And often when leaders do say that, they don't actually mean, recreating something that existed in the past. They mean that what they're trying to do is have you recall a memory of how you felt in the past or how your grandparents felt. And it's very evocative, it has tremendous power. And this happens on the right and the left, that you see it in revolutionary movements as well, that people will call on the past because we always look at the past with nostalgia. We always think of it as better, even if it didn't feel that way when we were actually there. We can't help it. And that, I think, is important because so much of how our lives are shaped by government policy are often bounded by what we believe to be possible. And what we believe to be possible is informed by history. If it's happened in the past, then we think, okay, we can live that way again. If we are told that it's never happened before, then we just think, no, that can't happen. And this is why, the myth of patriarchy having existed forever and being universal and timeless is so pernicious, because it precludes us from ever imagining a gender equal society, even though we know that those societies have existed.
One of the, you open the book actually with a description of the goddess Kali, is central to Hinduism, and it's not, it's difficult if you're coming out of the Judeo-Christian system to imagine this, but there isn't really as much of a hierarchy between Shiva and Kali. They seem to be interdependent, and Kali is. Well, you describe it very well, but she's a destroyer.
Yeah.
The imagery is profound, and when some feminists discover for the first time the figure of Kali, it's been very powerful.
Yeah.
So tell us.
Yeah, Kali's become very popular in New York circles because of what she represents. That Hinduism is an unusual religion in that it's not organized in the same way that the monotheistic faiths are. It's quite relaxed. So my mum, for instance, who is Hindu, at home she will have a Hindu god, but she will also have, because my dad grew up in a Sikh family, he's not very religious, she will have the Sikh gods. She has a picture of the Queen in there. she has lots of different things, but that's the pluralistic way in which this faith works. So it's very adaptable. That's not to say there are no patriarchal elements in there. There are. If you read the Rig Vedas, which is this very ancient Hindu text, it is very focused on sons. There is no doubt that there's an obsession with sons. But also there is a huge panoply of deities, many of whom are female, but not female in a kind of narrow sense.
Yes.
But, strong and powerful in their own right. So Kali, this bright blue skin in the way that she's depicted, bright blue skin, this shock of wavy black hair reaching almost to her feet. In one hand, she's holding the head of a demon, and it's dripping with blood, and around her waist, and she's got lots of arms, and each of them are holding, a big sword, lots of different things. Around her waist will be disembodied body parts. Through her ears, in some depictions, are corpses. She's dripping with blood, and she's standing on a demon that she's just killed. But on her face is a look of ecstasy. She's not looking angry. She's not looking sad. She is looking ecstatic, happy, and that it feels subversive to us. But also, doesn't it feel a little bit recognizable? Mm-hmm. Don't we all feel a little bit like that sometimes? We have that within us, that kind of anger, that strength, that powerfulness, and I think. What you see in these ancient scripts, even though they can be used in such narrow ways now, is that plurality does exist. And it has always existed. People have always known that it exists. You see it in, among the Greek gods as well. Athena, the goddess of war, as well as the goddess of other things. That there is, there are lots of different ways to be a woman, and that's not a new thing. It's not like we've only just learnt that. We've always known that there are lots of different ways.
Kali's the destroyer, not only of these corpses around her, but she's considered the destroyer of evil and of ignorance.
Yeah,
which I love.
And she's a mother goddess. That's the other thing to remember, that she's still a mother goddess, and she's worshipped as a mother goddess.
Let's talk for a moment about the findings at Çatal Hayek, where you've been in modern-day Turkey, and it is Turkey, right?
Yeah,
yeah, and the discussion around the great goddess.
Yeah. So one of the first things I wanted to do when I was writing this book, and I have to say I started it just before the pandemic, and usually I travel a lot when I'm writing. I always go to places firsthand, I interview everybody firsthand, and it became very difficult. But the first window that I had, which was around the autumn of 2020, I went to Çatal Hayek, which is a very famous site in southern Anatolia, in Turkey, on the border with Syria, modern-day Syria. And why this site is so important is because when it was excavated in the 1960s, it was dubbed the oldest city in the world. And there are arguments over whether it really was a city or not, but what we do know is that it was occupied at least 9,000 years ago. So just to put that into context, that is thousands of years older than the first pyramids in Egypt, thousands of years older than Stonehenge. So it's one of the oldest human settlements in the world, and incredibly sophisticated. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And it still mystifies me as to why it's still so rarely visited. I've been to Pompeii and Herculaneum, which are ram-packed, I have to say. You have to really kind of struggle to get through the streets there. I went to Çatal Hayek. I was the only one there. It's really surprising because it's jaw-droppingly beautiful. There are these, what we would recognize now, the architecture isn't exactly how we live now, but it's recognizable in as much as you have these kind of box-like rooms with a hearth. People were buried in platforms underneath the floors in their houses, so new levels of the settlement were built on top of the old ones. So it's almost like a honeycomb, it looks like. There are no streets or passages in between. There are no doors. There's a hole in the roof and a ladder, and you would go up and down out of your house using that ladder and the hole in the roof, and then your business, everything gets done on top of the houses. So it looks like a honeycomb when you see it. Now, the reason that Çatal Hayek is important is because, of course, if we want to understand the origins of inequality, then what can that place tell us about how people lived back then, pre-writing, pre-any of modern-day religions? How do people live? And you can learn a surprising amount from that archaeological data. For instance, the kind of work that people did. Using human remains, you can know what kind of work they were doing, how they were buried. The patterns of burials can tell you a lot. You can see what they were eating. And all the data that we have from Çatal Hayek so far, and I will always caveat everything by saying so far, because we may uncover more, we don't know. It's a very big settlement.
It's a huge site, isn't it, with a small amount excavated.
And we only have data from part of it. But as the lead archaeologist at that site, Ian Hodder, was telling me, all the data that we have from Çatal Hayek tells us that men and women lived pretty much the same lives there. They ate the same kind of food, which is important because people of different status eat different amounts of food. And even in modern day societies, let's be honest, women end up eating less than men for lots of different reasons. They did the same work, so patterns of wear and tear on the body were exactly the same between men and women. They spent the same amount of time indoors and outdoors, and we can tell that through soot residue inside people's chest cavities. Even the height difference between men and women was small, which again is important because we imagine physical differences between men and women, and I'm not saying that there is no biological difference there, of course there is, but the extent of that difference is also determined by how we live, So this is a society in which, because people were doing and living roughly the same lives, they didn't look that different from each other in terms of height difference. So we can't say that this was a gendered society. That's what Ian Hodder said to me, that this looks to have been an ungendered society, and one in which women were not invisible. And we know that because the vast majority of figurines not only at Çatalhöyük, but from across that whole region, so this is near the Fertile Crescent, are female, or at least appear to be female. The most famous at Çatalhöyük is a seated woman. So I urge you, if you can, to look this up on Google when you get home, because she is incredible. And I saw her myself. She's in a museum in Anatolia. So this depicts a woman that looks to be an older woman, and she's sitting with her back completely straight, and there's these huge rolls of skin kind of spilling out all around her everywhere. And her hands are like this, and underneath each of them is what looks to be a big cat or a leopard, that's what archaeologists think, looking straight ahead. She looks so powerful. And in fact, in the 1960s, when this figurine was first found, they described her as the great goddess, because everybody assumed at that time there was a common belief that humans were matriarchal first and then we became patriarchal. So this was thought to be evidence of that matriarchal past, that here was the great goddess.
Childless cat lady, which I could just have well.
Well, she had two cats. It looked like a childless cats lady. And it was only over time that, archaeologists, because we can't know, we don't have written evidence, all we have are frescoes. The frescoes depict people hunting, vultures picking over dead bodies. None of it is gendered, as far as we can tell. So it's all conjecture. We can't really know whether she was a real person or a depiction of a goddess or what she was. To me, and this is also Ian Hodder's, where he was leaning, it looks to be a real person, because she's very naturalistic. Possibly a senior figure within her family, possibly. We just don't know. But the point is that there are so many figurines like this.
Yes.
So women are not being ignored. They are perfectly visible in the record at that time. And so the big question becomes, if that's how people were living in what is modern-day Turkey now, 9,000 years ago, well, Turkey now is very patriarchal. How and when did things change?
It's interesting. I think the obvious analogy in Europe would be the Venus of Willendorf, another Neolithic, massive Neolithic figure. And we don't know. Again, is this a goddess? Is this simply, it could an object of beauty as well?
Or a doll. Admire. And we really have no idea. And it's one of the frustrations, I think, for archaeologists, is that they can't know. And I interviewed this very prominent female archaeologist, one of the pioneering female archaeologists, Ruth Tringham, and she works at that very small scale level. So she prefers to try and understand, how did individuals live in a place like this? Try and get as much information about individuals as possible. And I think that's a very beautiful way of looking at history, because frankly, and we know this from our own experiences in the present, that every single person is different. It's not as though every woman in this room is living exactly the same life, or every woman in this country is living exactly the same life. So we can only, the only real truth that we can ever get at is the truth about that individual person.
Let's talk about the woman who was most active in promoting this great goddess theory. And
Maria
so forth.
Gimbutas.
Yes, exactly. Let's talk about her and her reception and her influence. Yeah.
So it's very difficult to write about this topic, about the origins of patriarchy, without bumping into Maria Gimbutas, the late brilliant Lithuanian archaeologist who became very famous in the 60s, 70s and 80s for her view that we were all matriarchal once and that we became patriarchal later. So she really
through violent
popularized
overthrow.
that.
Through violent overthrow of those cultures. Yeah.
So she grew up in Lithuania, where there is lots of folklore about women, witches, and women who turn into animals and transformation.
Baba Yaga.
Baba Yaga. And she married that with the archaeological data that she was getting, that was coming out of places like Çatalhöyük, and said that Europe was matriarchal once, old Europe, as she termed it, so this is prehistoric, Neolithic Europe, and that there was a big overthrow that happened with invaders coming from the east, who suddenly made everything patriarchal. And feminists really ran with this. I mean, Gloria Steinem definitely did. In her work, you can see that, that view coming out. But archaeologists, she became widely discredited within archaeology for that point of view, partly because because there is so much sexism and, and misogyny within the sciences and the academy, but also because she did tend to overinterpret stuff. You know, when she would see things, she would immediately say, "This is a symbol of the goddess."
Yes.
Whether even if it was very ambiguous, she would just say it's a goddess.
Yeah.
Everything came back to the goddess all the time, and so it became quite easy to make a figure of fun. But what's interesting is that in recent decades, with the rise of ancient DNA evidence, so this is a huge revolution within genetics, in which we can now decode genetic data from very ancient specimens, which is incredibly difficult to do. And it means that now we can understand, for example, more about Neanderthals. We can understand, from ancient specimens who lived where, migration patterns. Well, it turns out there was a big migration from the Eurasian steppe into Europe. Not quite at the same time that she said, but not that far off. And it's prompted all these male geneticists now and male archaeologists to revisit her work and start wondering whether she was maybe right about a few things.
She said.
And she even said this before she died. So I interviewed her best friend who co-wrote her last book with her. It was published posthumously. And she said that Maria Gimbutas said to her before she died, "Don't worry, 20 years from now, everyone will know that I'm right." And that's exactly what happened. 20 years later, all these academics began revisiting her work again.
It's fascinating. I think that we have to talk about, especially in light of the what's going on legally, the wrangles over abortion in the U.S. right now. We have to talk about abortion in the ancient world. What do we know? Is it are the prohibitions against abortion mainly patriarchal and post-patriarchal? Is there archaeological evidence of women controlling the number of births in this way?
It's actually quite central to the question, and I'll explain that. So I'll go right back to the beginning. So a lot of you may be thinking now, so Çatalhöyük was, gender was not a big issue in how people lived there, but then things did change. How and when did they change? Now, in terms of the historical data, when we see that big change happening, is not with agriculture. We see women involved in agriculture even well into antiquity, but with the emergence of the first states. So this is, if you imagine ancient Mesopotamia, just as Gerda Lerner said, Assyria. When you are creating a state for the first time, just imagine a world in which anyone can live however they want. People are living as farmers, hunter-gatherers, a mix of things, nomads, living all over the world in lots of different ways. If you are creating a state, if you belong to one of the elites, and I'm not using elites in any other way, in any other sense other than people who happen to have more wealth and power than anyone else in a community, who are authorities in a community. If you belong to that group and you want to create a state in which people will live, they will be willing to create a surplus for you, who will defend the state against attack. That's asking a lot of people, right? So the big concern in these early states, naturally, is population. How do we get people to live here, and how do we get them to stay and defend our state? So what you see over time is that, and this is something that James C. Scott, again, he just passed away very recently, late political scientist, argued that population is the big preoccupation. If you look at ancient Assyrian tablets, list. It's list of resources, list of people. They want to know what they have. They want to tabulate everything. And what you see over time then, of course, is that people get shuttled into certain roles and responsibilities within a society. People are assigned things to do. In hunter-gatherer societies or in subsistence societies, everyone has to do everything. Even the kids, everyone has to join in everything. You have to be skilled at doing everything. And that's why we know that even...
You see that in Mongolia, for example. Yeah.
And you see it in modern-day hunter-gatherer societies that women can hunt often just as well as the men can, because they have to be able to. Everyone has to. But in these kind of first early states, what you get is this division of labor emerging. And because of this concern about population, pressure naturally falls on the family, because the family is the unit of population. Pressure falls on young women to have as many kids as possible, so more than they would otherwise. And pressure falls on young men because they're not giving birth to those kids to defend the state. So you can see quite naturally how those very early binary gender roles emerged then. Women became associated with motherhood, and men became associated with fighting and bravery. Even though, you know, we have very good evidence from before that time that women were hunting. We have lots of female hunter burials discovered right throughout the Americas. We know that women were doing everything. But then as the states started to grow, that changed. That, you know, women get shuttled into this role, men get shuttled into that role, and women start to disappear from the archaeological or the historical record as they become more domesticated. And that's still the case today. That twin preoccupation, that gendered concern about population, birth rates, and defense, you can see, for example, in modern day Russia. So a couple of last year I was writing a piece for the Financial Times because Russia, obviously with the Ukraine war, was losing lots of young men, desperately needed to recruit more people into the war effort. These young men were leaving the country because they didn't want to be conscripted. So the government put out an advertising campaign. The advertising campaign to recruit more soldiers was "Be a man." You know, this is an exhortation to your masculinity. This is what masculinity means in a patriarchal state, that you will fight and defend the state. And at the same time, just before that, interestingly, Russia announced a state honor for women who have more than 10 kids, a medal, Mother Heroine Medal. So this is how women then are serving the state, by having as many children as possible. Now, personally, there is no medal big enough for me to have 10 kids. I would need way more than a medal. But, you know, it's interesting, you know, that here in this, under Putin, this, you know, intensely patriarchal society, you know, and it's interesting to look at how other states have responded, because in other countries, people have responded to the shortage of male soldiers by having women enter the military. In the US now, women can serve in any military role. But in Russia, because of that kind of addiction to this kind of patriarchal idea of power, it's still that way. And this comes back to your question then on abortion. Why is abortion a state interest? Why should it be in any interest of the state what, you know, other medical procedures are not? Why abortion? And it comes down to this population question. Because unless you can control reproduction in some way, then you can't control your population size. And you see this not just in the US, but in the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union was first created, one of the very first laws they passed was to make abortion legal. Because so many women they knew were dying having these illegal abortions. And in service to this idea of women's equality, they made abortion legal. Stalin came in, birth rates were falling, and he made it illegal again. So this is a tool, this is a state tool that is used by governments in order to manage reproduction, and not just abortion. Also, you know, this, I mean, just coming back to your comment about Vance's childless cat lady's idea, this idea that it's just inappropriate for women not to have kids or to not be mothers.
Well, we know they don't really have a purpose if they don't.
Yeah.
And Vance is on record as having said that that the purpose of postmenopausal women is childcare.
Yeah. And it's, you know, and it's a very narrow definition of what a woman is. You know, I'm a mum myself, and I'm a very happy mum. My sister never wanted kids. She's quite happy without having children, and that's normal. You know, not all women want to have kids or can have kids or make good mothers. Just like not all dads are, you know, great dads, or not all men want to have kids either. So we have to appreciate that is part of normal, natural human variation. What patriarchy does is say that, no, you can't have a life like that. You have to live it this way. And I think that's important to remember, because for me, ending patriarchy is not just about freeing women, then it's also about freeing men. And I think that's especially important for progressives and liberals to remember, because I think so much work has gone into selling gender equality to women. We also, there's a lot here for men too. You know, that freedom, all those Russian boys trying to flee conscription, there's a lot in it for them too.
Absolutely. That's a great moment to turn this to audience questions. Although I could go on and on. There's so much here, and so much in the book. There's a chapter on modern day Iran that is fabulous toward the end. So what we will do is that the microphones will come toward you. Please stand and please ask a true question.
Hi. My question has to do with the archaeological findings of women who were warriors and how that fits into what you've been talking about.
Yeah, I mean, this is fascinating. There's actually a very good book on this topic, Women Warriors, by Pamela Toller, the military historian. And what she shows is that right on every single continent in the world, there have been not just women warriors, but female military leaders as far back as we can remember. So absolutely everywhere. And she remarks that what is strange is not that they exist, because we should expect there to be women warriors, but that they sit so lightly on our consciousness that we don't accept that they are almost treated as aberrations or something marginal to the bigger story. But actually they are just as central as...
That's right. They're still viewed as so exceptional that they don't matter, and they get forgotten. And when a new one arises, we're like, oh, look, a female leader.
Wow, wow, is this happening? And I think it's that individual story that I think is important to remember. And this is the theme of a lot of my work, is that sometimes when we think about people just in terms of these very narrow categories, we forget the evidence of our own eyes that people live in so many different ways, that they're capable of so many different things. You know, I come from a military family myself. My dad's family are all in the military. And the women are incredibly strong and powerful and, serve in lots of different ways. So I just think, it's a kind of ignored history rather than an invisible one. It exists, it's right there, but we just don't imagine it.
There's sometimes a sense of incredulity on the part of archaeologists when they're discovering these things.
I mean, there was this finding, so in modern day Peru, so this is around the same time as Çatalhöyük was last occupied, so 9,000 years ago. In the Andes, archaeologists discovered the remains of what looked to be a hunter, and the reason they thought it was a hunter was because there were, weapons, flint, the knife points, all the accoutrements of a hunter.
Always.
And immediately they assumed that it must be a man, but then analysis of the remains showed that it was a woman, and they didn't know what to make of it. It was so strange, and you can read this in the paper that was written up afterwards. The archaeologists write that people were saying, well, maybe these objects just fell in there, or maybe they were ceremonial and they weren't actually used by this person. Explanations that wouldn't be given if it really had been a male whose remains it was. So it's interesting how, for me, especially as a science journalist, we should be led by the data. If the data tells us that this was a female hunter, then it's a female hunter. Why do you have to come up with fancy explanations for anything else if you know that, that's what the evidence is showing you? If later counter evidence comes along, fine. Then you revise that idea. But for the time being, we have to live with what we have, and what we have tells us that 9,000 years ago, in the Americas, big game hunting was not a gendered activity, because we genuinely don't have evidence that says anything else. What's surprising to me is that so often we start with this kind of Flintstones idea of what the past was, that Fred is going out and, doing everything. Wilma's at home with the kids in the cave. It couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, genuinely, that is not how history looks at all.
And prehistory? Okay, so on this side.
I have a question that I've always wondered about, and that is with so many women over history, for the longest time until about the 20th century, they were dying in childbirth before they ever got to middle age or got old enough to really grasp power, I guess, and keep it. Did that have any effect on the fact that patriarchy evolved, especially in our society?
That's a very interesting observation, and it's possible that may be a mechanism, but then it would also assume that the numbers of women were always lower above a certain age right throughout history. I don't know if we have great evidence of that. What we do have good genetic data, though, showing us that in that transition period, so around the Neolithic onwards, you see a dramatic drop in the number of men who are having lots of children, or at least children who have survived, ancestors who have survived into the present. So you see this contraction on the male line, but not a contraction on the female. So lots of women are still having kids. Number of men shrinks dramatically. And some geneticists have argued that from that, you can surmise that there is some form of inequality emerging between men. That there are powerful men who are having lots of children, less powerful men who aren't having any children at all, or at least not children who survive into the present. And we can see this also because now, if you look at genetic data from present modern day people, they've identified, for instance, that I think it's 1 in 20, like a very high number of men in, I don't know, I can't remember if it's all of Asia or all of the world, are related to someone who lived around the same time as Genghis Khan. And Genghis Khan, we know, had lots of wives, lots of concubines, and so did his sons. So his sons also had lots of wives and lots of concubines. And he is considered, one of these history's patriarchs then, that he was just living a very different life from the other men. And I think that's, again, that's important to remember, that when we generalize about the past, the reason I called this book The Patriarchs is because the patriarchs are not all men. It's just some men. It's a small sliver of men at the top. Most men are having actually quite miserable lives and dying very young. Fighting, women may be dying in childbirth, but they're dying out in the battlefield defending their states. So I think, it works both ways.
Okay, on this side. Are you ready?
Hey, you had mentioned a 20th century memoir of a man who lived in Kerala, a matriarchal society, and I was just wondering if you remember the name or the title.
I can't, but it's referenced in here, so I can find it. I'm so sorry, because I wrote this book came out last year, and I've been working on another book since then, so now that brain space has been taken over by this new book. But it's referenced in here, so you can use it.
Is there anything else on this side? Back here. Okay. Oh, 2 on that side then. Okay.
This is the elephant in the room election question, but I just want to thank you for your scholarship, and it just continues to be so important. But for the past 20 years, I remember as a grad student in 2008, I had a professor who liked to think that he was a political prophet when Obama and Hillary were neck and neck for becoming the candidate. He told us in class that, quite frankly, as a country and as a society, we are more misogynistic than we are racist. And as a 20-something-year-old, I was heartbroken, outraged, all that, and still don't think I agree with it. But now as a 40-something-year-old who's watched this play out over and over again, where women who are qualified just keep losing out to people who are less qualified, it's hard not to... Anyway, but your scholarship tells us that this is not inevitable. So, just saying that our society is misogynistic and that we, it's, that's throwing our hands up. So what do you have to say about any of that for hope?
It's complicated because obviously you can probably tell by my accent, I grew up in Britain, and we've had a number of female prime ministers, not always the best ones. We had Liz Truss, who wasn't great. And you do have female leaders in this country, and Kamala Harris was still a VP, so it's not as though she didn't accumulate any power at all. But I do think that the US was founded on a very specific idea of what womanhood was. So if you look at, for instance, the founding fathers and their very early decision not to give women the vote, despite women, their own wives telling them, think again about this, just consider us. And the reason they did that was because of this idea of female domesticity, that a woman's place is in the home. If she is to exercise political power, it has to be done vicariously through her husband or her sons. And that is, I think, even to this day, even though it is in so many other ways a very progressive country, I mean, the rest of the world looks to America for its progressive movements. It's really quite remarkable. And I personally, as someone who's moved here, have found myself challenged all the time as a scholar who writes about gender and race in wonderful ways, because there is such great work being done here. But I think that central founding principle, I think, just holds so much power over how people imagine themselves and how power works. I don't think this will last forever. I don't think there will never be a female president. I'm certain there will be. There are very many more female leaders around the world than there have been. In fact, Sri Lanka has just elected a woman leader again, and it was the first country in the world, incidentally, to elect a woman leader. I just think that there are other factors at play as well. So don't feel dejected, because I have to say, you know, the landscape is very different depending on where you are in the world, and we can do better than this. I do wonder, though, if, especially given the experience of the UK, whether the first female president might be a Republican.
It does seem, looking around the world, that it's a little easier to elect a woman who is on the right. Maybe that's slightly less threatening to those who share those ideals.
Yeah.
I think it was funny. I was reading up a little on Giorgia Meloni, thinking about this conversation, and I hadn't realized that the hard right party that she's part of is called Brothers of Italy.
Yeah.
So this was their candidate, and she won. And she has a so-so record on women's rights so far.
Yeah, and we shouldn't expect, the fact is, we shouldn't expect women to care about gender equality all the time. We have other things that we also care about.
Exactly. Yeah.
And as confusing as that might be from the outside, that is also to be expected, you know. And that's also, in some ways, a mark of progress. Not to say that I want to live in a world in which all the women are right-wing, but it's good to have plurality. It means that these spaces are opening up, and that there are other things that we care about as well. And that, you know, it's not always just about gender. Yeah.
Back here.
It's fascinating to see how the old matriarchal societies had many facets and were quite harmonious. How can we tap into this ancient wisdom to recreate a healthy gender balance that is not threatening to men? Because to your point, it's not men or women.
No, yeah, absolutely. It doesn't have to be men or women. That's a very lovely question. Well, you know, the reason I don't present these matrilineal societies as a model for how I would want to live now. I don't necessarily want to live in any of them. What I want to remind people of is that how society is structured now, in whichever society you're in, is not the only way to live. There are other ways to live, and people prove that all the time, all over the world, and they have done right throughout history. And I think that does matter because, like I said, we are bounded, our imaginations are bounded by what we believe is possible. So for me, an ideal society would be one in which I can live without my gender being a problem to anyone, without me being, you know, stopped from doing anything because of that. And that's not necessarily what these matrilineal societies are like. They still think about gender, they just think about it in a different way. And I believe that is also possible, because you see glimmers of it in Çatalhöyük. Not that you should need history. I mean, Frantz Fanon said this. You shouldn't be bound by history. You shouldn't be determined by it. But I do think there is a part of us that needs it in order to feel, in order to remember what's possible.
Is that two more questions, very fast ones.
Hi.
Over here.
I would like to ask you about an event I saw in India a number of years ago. I think it was in Chennai. It could have been in Hyderabad. And it was a celebration of women. It was a goddess day. And I could never, I mean, it stayed with me, and I've always wondered whether it was an expression of women's power or repression that it brought out so many women.
Well, these kind of, it might have been a Durga, for Durga, the goddess. There are very many Indian goddesses. It might have been a Kali, celebration of Kali. Everyone celebrates these goddesses in India. It's hard to explain. I've lived there twice, and obviously I grew up with my mum, who is, very much, who's very, very Hindu. So she observes it very closely in her own life, and it's bizarre to me that gender isn't made an issue when it comes to the goddesses. It's almost incidental that these goddesses happen to be female rather than male. Yeah. But they won't have been there because she's a woman. They will have been there because women are often the keepers of these traditions, and women are the ones that follow these traditions more closely. And that can be as limiting as it can be liberating in some ways. And we have to remember that, when we're talking about the heavens or gods and goddesses, we're not talking about, we understand that that's different from how we live. So the Greeks, for instance, had goddesses, very powerful goddesses, but ancient Athens was also one of the worst places in history to be a woman. It was so restrictive in the controls it put, especially on a certain class of women, above a certain social category. And they could hold both those ideas at the same time. That you can have a society that's very patriarchal and yet still worships goddesses, which India is, frankly, and those contradictions are part of what makes a country such a fascinating place, that both those things can be true.
Okay, I think we're down now to one more quickie. In the foreground here, in the sweater.
Yes, my question is, as religions are sort of destabilized around the world, it seems to me that patriarchy has been one of the ways in which they are asserting greater power, and could you just speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. This religion question comes up a lot, and I have to say, when I moved here, Britain, of course, is it is a religious state. It's a Christian country. The US is, at least nominally, a secular country, but this is a far more religious country in practice to me. People invoke God a lot. And so this question comes up a lot, the role of religion in the perpetuation of patriarchy. And what we have to remember is that Christianity, Islam, Judaism come after the rise of the state and the changing of gender roles in society. So it predates, the emergence of patriarchy predates by thousands of years the growing of the religions. And what's also important to remember is that when they were first emerging, so for example, when Christianity was first emerging as a cult in ancient Rome, it wasn't seen as patriarchal then. It was seen as, radically egalitarian. That's why people flocked to it, is that it was preaching something that in ancient Rome, at least, nobody had ever heard before. We're all equal. Nobody was saying that. This was a slave-owning society in which there were very strict hierarchies between people. Women went to it, the poor went to it because Christianity promised something else. But what you get over time is, as the interests of the religion become intertwined with the interests of the state, so the establishment becomes intertwined with the interests of the state, is that, and wealth is involved there, power is involved there, that the religions become more and more patriarchal over time because the state already is. So, for example, I was in the Vatican earlier this year. If you go to the Vatican, you will know that it is just dripping in wealth. There are frescoes and beautiful, very expensive, everything is gold, marble, and very few women. Even the workers in the Vatican tend to be men. So there are very few women even working there. It's a very male place and very, very wealthy. That is no accident. That is part of how power works, that as the power of the establishment of the faith became intertwined with the state power, that it worked towards those same ends. So the Pope today, there are so many things the Pope could be interested in, but why is sex and family such a major one up there? Why is he so concerned about how many kids people are having? He was just complaining recently that Italian couples are having dogs instead of having kids, urging them to have more children. Why does he care? He cares because the state cares about that, and it has cared about that for thousands of years. And so, of course, the Vatican is a state as well. That's something that he will have to care about too. It doesn't have to be this way. And in fact, in the US, there is a very rich tradition of women's rights activism trying to reframe Christian thought in a way that is consistent with feminism. So, the Women's Bible was written here in the US in an attempt to kind of bring Christianity to a place where women wanted it to be. And those kind of efforts are happening all over the world in lots of different ways, including within Islam. Islamic feminists are doing exactly the same, trying to study the texts and reframe them in such a way that are consistent with feminism.
I want to thank you so much for coming to Charleston and for writing this wonderful book.
You're welcome.
And
Thank
we
you,
have signed
Angela.
books available.
Thank you so much, Angela. Thank you, Regina. And also thank you, Regina, for stepping in at the very last moment as interlocutor. Jeanette Alterman was supposed to be the interlocutor, but she's sick, so we hope she has a speedy recovery. And when you leave, if you leave through the back doors and take a left, you can go to the Buxton Pop-Up Bookshop and get Angela to sign your book. And I think this is a great book to give your daughters and your mothers and your brothers and your fathers. Thank you for coming. Bye-bye. Thank you.